Well, howdy there. How's the week been for you? It's been hotter than a Cardassian sauna over here in Scotland, but we're making do. As far as Project Star Trek, I've been digging into my two main tasks this week. The first being coming up with a story and the characters for the treatment, and the second coming up with, understanding what exactly a treatment is. In this video, I'm going to mostly talk through what I've found people expect when they hear the term treatment or when they ask for a treatment, and go through how I'm thinking about those expectations. I will go into the story a little bit, but next week's episode will be all about story, so I'll leave most of it to then. So initially, I had thought that in order to pitch a series, you needed a full pilot script. And that kind of always turned me off because I've never really written a script before, and I just assumed that I would just get very frustrated by the process. The idea of a treatment sounded a little bit of a shortcut to me, to be honest, closer to the idea of a story, but I didn't really know if it was like a story or just a synopsis or some sort of outline or somewhere in between. To start my research, I headed over to YouTube, fired up the YouTube engine, and found a really, really useful channel called Film Courage that had a bunch of really interesting videos. One of those videos featured a guy called Shane Stanley, and I found that one super valuable. You can find that one right up here. Shane is a producer and a writer, and he sees lots of scripts. And in the video, he goes into some of the assumptions that writers have versus how the industry actually works, which is, as you could imagine, maybe a little bit disconnected. Some of the comments on the video made it kind of sound like what he was saying was like everything that's wrong with the industry. However, I kind of took it a bit differently. Essentially, his point was that what you're doing is trying to sell an idea, to sell a story. And the film and TV industry is just that, an industry. It's a business. Yes, it's art, but the public have pretty short attention spans. And the approach needs to convince those in charge to take a punt on something that they think will be entertaining enough to make a profit at the end of the day. Side note, I'm also mindful that decision makers in Hollywood are still predominantly very much white males. All the videos that I found giving advice were from white males, and it can definitely be lazy to dismiss something as unsellable just because some white executive doesn't get it. I think the industry has a long way to go in terms of embracing writing and story methods and subject matter that challenges the way that things are done and serve more audiences with authenticity, and I just wanted to acknowledge that. Okay, back to the advice. Yes, talking about a pitch in terms of it being a business makes everything sound kind of cold and unfeeling. And you might think that it leads to a lot of cliches used over and over again, which it does. But the goal here isn't to produce some avant-garde, completely revolutionary concept when it comes to storytelling. It's to design a show that is mass market entertainment that people will actually watch. So instead of thinking about it in how it's degrading the writing experience or the author's experience, I'm choosing instead to see this as an example of providing well understood constraints with which you can push through something pretty amazing. Brilliance can come in all shapes, and some of the best shows and films do so, working within and tweaking existing tropes just as much as those that eschew them completely. Something great about The Mandalorian is that it's basically a Western over and over again. I think every single description of every episode, or most of them, has a mysterious stranger coming into town. There is something interesting about using existing and well-trodden tropes, but in a slightly modern and different way. It's like how broadcast TV, at least in the US, has certain rules, like no swearing and no nudity. I've always liked that, not because I'm particularly prudish, but if you have to convey anger or an argument without any swearing, that's a skill. If you have to convey passionate intimacy without being allowed to show two people boinking on camera, that's also likewise a skill, right? It's also like how utterly devastating some children's films can be. The constraints there are even higher, but a great kids film is emotional and adventurous and all those other things, both for children and for the parents and the guardians of those children. It's a really, really tough thing to get right. If you watched Up without tearing up, I salute you. You're a monster, but I salute you. So back to Shane. In the interview, he talks about how producers don't really want to or have time to invest their time in reading your script until they have some indication that it's worth that time. That is the mission of the treatment, to get that interest, to get that next step. It reminds me quite a bit of pitching for investment for startups, something I do and help others do all the time. An email or a pitch deck's job should be pretty specific. It shouldn't try to answer all questions at all stages, right? Often the mission of a deck that's sent to maybe an investor cold is literally just to get a call. When founders send the kitchen sink to an investor cold, that's a bit overwhelming, and it allows for doubt and lots of questions to start without hearing the most important part, which is obviously the founder's perspective, the story, and their approach to the problem. Shorter decks get calls, so it makes sense that tighter, simpler treatments get requests for scripts. Shane says that the treatment should consist of 4 things: title, author, logline, and a 2-page synopsis with a paragraph per act. Now, I don't yet know what a logline is, but I will find out. But everything else kind of makes sense. He talks about what's going through a producer's mind when they're reading this. Can it sell? Are there catchphrases? Are there hero moments? Are there tent poles to the story? He also interestingly says that he won't look at a treatment unless it has a USCO copyright. I had no idea that you needed to actually register a copyright for it to be legit. Apparently it's something that costs about $35 via the USCO website. So that's another thing that I'm going to have to do and figure out how to do. But I really liked Shane's video. It makes sense. I think the only challenge that I can see is how do you convey some deeper background about these characters without giving a character synopsis? Because especially if it's character driven, which so much TV is, how can you do that in a paragraph per act little synopsis? So that's going to be tough for me. In a story, you usually accomplish this by taking side tracks or having flashbacks to talk about their background and share that background in a more kind of structured way. So I don't yet know how that's going to fly, but obviously I have to figure that out. In another video, Dr. Ken Achiti says that you take an idea that ends a normal state of life and you begin again, and you should be looking to end a pilot with a major question. He says you really just don't want to give a dry synopsis in your treatment just because that's a dry summary of a story and that's not engaging. In a good treatment, he says, you establish a story, you diagnose the faults of the story, and then you fix them, bringing the audience along for the ride. And so this is pretty cool to hear. In another video, a guy named Glenn Gares makes a good point as well. The interchange between characters are the basic building blocks of story. I have to get this thing. There's something that stands in my way. How am I going to get past that thing in my way to get that thing? That is interesting, right? Obstacles put in the way of characters is basically what most stories are. So you need to make sure that this is very clear going into it, and then it's not just exposition about the sadness of your character, right? Another video has Peter Russell going further in an interview that you can find wherever, here as well, all about the 9 questions that TV writers need to answer. The 9 questions are, number 1, what's the location? What makes it super interesting? You need to make that detailed. It's not just a specific city like New York or Philadelphia, but like what neighborhood? You need to make it real. 2, do you have a theme that matters? Like, what do you want to say about the world through your TV show? 3, what are you passionate about? 4, what do you believe in? 5, why do we want to watch this show every week? Like, what is the big question? He uses an example of, Breaking Bad. What will Walter get up to this week? 6, what's the genre that you have to stick in your genre? That might be a little bit harder for me, just in terms of what it is that I want to try and do. 7 is, what are the parents of the show? So, like, what are you reacting to with this piece? 8 is, what are the questions that torments the heroes that will probably never be resolved? And the 9th one is, what's the big core wound in your hero? Is it that they're unlovable, that they're weak, that they're not safe? So there's a lot here. There's a lot to work through, and I think there's some great tests that I can put my story through to see if I'm able to satisfy at least a majority of these questions. Shane Stanley, again, also suggested to check out a website called Script Revolution to see examples of how to write a treatment, so I'm definitely going to check that out as well. So how will this go with my story? What I like here is that, luckily, my story already had some of these elements. I was thinking about common TV tropes and how I could adapt my idea to make a solid show, and I was thinking about inspirations of really good comfort TV that are also detective themed shows that I maybe can take inspiration from. And luckily, they fit a lot of these things really, really well. So I felt like I was actually off to a pretty good start. If you'd like to read the super, super, super rough work that I've done so far, you can check out the Notion that I put together. That's in the description below. This week, I'm going to get my notes together and make an outline of what I have and also identify the gaps and what I still need to work on. Different people talk about treatment length of anywhere between 2 and 15 pages. I think I'm going to try and keep it as short as possible. That'll force me to kind of keep it tight. But then I'll have an appendix with a lot more information in case a reader wants to dive into a character or an idea or an arc or a vibe or something like that. In terms of the actual story, next week's video will be all about that. I'll go into detail about plot, characters, and my motivations for structuring it the way that I am. However, as a bit of a maybe meta teaser, if you will, I want to design a show that looks at the franchise, at the Star Trek franchise, from a different angle, but that keeps the fundamental elements that make it so comforting, that make like Trek so comforting as a show. It's still a bit too early to tell how new Trek will feel after, dozens of rewatchings, but I and a lot of other people love how comforting old Trek is. Probably because it's been with us for so long, right? You are let into these people's lives. You get time to sit there for a while. You appreciate the familiar sounds, the voices, and the views. I also love how utopian and comforting old Trek is, but sometimes people can mistake the utopian optimism as the reason that they find old Trek so comforting. Galactic optimism feels fake to me. Unless the realism of the cost of that utopia is clearly understood and digested. DS9 is an inherently optimistic but devastating show with real darkness, but it's still comforting. You can absolutely do optimism through darkness, and I think you can absolutely do comfort through struggle. I'm interested in exploring that darkness and struggle, but on a more micro level. My story doesn't take place in the Federation, though the Federation itself is kind of a character in it. The struggles that will be faced by aliens far away from Earth should still strike a familiar human feel. I'm using Star Trek as a playground in which to explore and kind of build things, not like many of the shows that are out right now, looking to somehow build lots of new Federation canon and expand that playground through kind of universe-affecting battles and big baddies that threaten the destruction of all humanity. I'm not so drawn to that as more, what is it actually like to live in this world from a different perspective? I think that would be fun. Next week, I'll go into more detail and we'll describe the plot, the characters, and the kind of vibe that I'm going for. If you want to be notified when that is available, please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon, and you'll get told when it's ready. Until then, be safe, be well, and have some fun.